Yoga is a very, very old and wonderful system that has been the gift of India to humanity for at least 3,000 years now, maybe more. And the beauty of yoga is that it is a very, very holistic system that is not just looking at our existence in the human form as a physical, biological, or a chemical structure, but also as an energetic structure. We all have not the same kind of energy. Some of us have more energy, some of us have less energy, some of us have more energy in the certain seasons, in certain times of the day. Some others have a different energy in different times of the day, different seasons. So we are also made up of an energetic dimension. We're also made up of an intellectual dimension. How our mind functions is also very different, very unique. Then we also have a dimension of our personality, our characters, our traits that define each person. Some people are more extroverted, some people are more introverted, some people talk very straightforward, some people talk a little bit roundabout, etc. Some people see the things in the world as positive. Some people see the things in the world with pessimistic eyes. So our personality is also quite unique, and that is also part of our system, as well as our emotional dimensions or spiritual dimensions, as we can call, a much more deeper dimension, that we are also spiritual beings, not just biological. So yoga looks at all of these constructs as part of the human system and gives us tools and techniques to influence these different dimensions in appropriate and positive manners, so that we achieve holistic health. There's no point in having a physically fit body if our emotions or mind is not good. There is also not a good idea if we just have an emotion and mind as good, but not a physical body as healthy. So yoga looks at all of these different dimensions, accepts them as essential parts of our human structure, human existence, and understands this, and therefore gives us technology to access this. It's quite different from how yoga is understood in modern times, especially in the Western country, as more like a gymnastic physical kind of exercise, because that is a very small part of yoga. Yoga is much, much bigger, and that is why I always love to understand it as a holistic health system that is a great gift for humanity, especially when you look at the current times now. We are living in a very challenging pandemic time. It's not just physical dimension that is getting affected. Many people have their mental dimensions, emotional dimensions as well being challenged, their energetic dimensions being challenged. And so yoga can be a very good solution for such people in all of these dimensions. So that is how yoga is a holistic system of well-being and health. It's it's also accessible for everybody, irrespective of the age or gender or physical or emotional capacity. We can always adapt and modify yoga to suit the individual, because the tool basket of yoga is very big, not limited to certain set of physical positions. This is something that we all have to understand. I've been thinking about this question myself for the last few months, and I really feel that what yoga can bring to the new generation is a new perspective. If you look at the modern world in the last 50 to 60, 70 years, we have all over the world, we have become a very, very materialistic culture that is very disconnected from reality and normality. We are not honoring the seasons of the nature. We are not honoring the connection to the things around us. We are not honoring what is important, like time with family, time with friends, we are all caught up in a rat race of chasing material things with money. So if you look at the current generation, the old generation of people like my grandfather's generation, they're all dead, they're all disappeared. So there is not so many people with that old perspective where there was connection to nature, where there was respect for humanity, where there was respect for nature, etc. And I think that's what yoga can bring us, is a new perspective. When we start thinking about it, why do we think that the Western world or the materialistic world now all over the world is interested in yoga? There's more products in the world today than any other time in history, everywhere in the world. It's not just in Europe, it's also in Asia, like India, China. There are so many products, but yet we are not satisfied with it. We are not happy. We don't find that happiness. So this is where yoga as a philosophical system can find and give us new perspective, because the message of yoga is to reconnect with humanity, reconnect with our body, reconnect with nature, reconnect with the environment we are, because the very word yoga is connection. And that's what we have become, disconnected from many realities and normalities. And I think that is the great gift that yoga can give the current generations. It's a new perspective. Start to look to reconnect with oneself first, then with others, then with nature and the universe. I think that is what yoga can give us. For me, I've also been reflecting this question a lot. And the more and more I'm getting older and more experienced in my life, I realize more and more how much influence my father has had on me, and to some degree, my grandfather as well. Uh, the role of a great master in our life, the role of a great teacher in a life, is not just for transmission of information. This we can do nowadays by internet. We can get all the information we want. In the old days, we could do it through libraries. You go to a library, good library that has a large collection of books. You have all the information that you want. So in a sense, the role of a teacher is not just to pass on information, but the role of the teacher is to inspire transformation. And that the inspiration for transformation, in my experience, happens in 2 or 3 dimensions. The first one is that the teacher themselves are an example, and the example always inspires. Now, even though I know my father very intimately, more than anybody else in this world knows him, because I grew up as his son, and I spent 24 hours a day with him. Many of his other students were only spending part of the time. I know the deep secrets of my father's life, which many others don't know. And I know that my father was not perfect. He was human. But yet, he could inspire so many people despite that humanity, or rather, I would even say, because of his humanity and imperfection. And I think that was a great inspiration for me personally. I also know the same about my grandfather. My grandfather was also a human being with certain defects and flaws, but it does not limit his capacity of greatness in the work, in the transmission of yoga that he did. So that's one of the great inspirations I've had from my father. The other inspiration for me has been, the other reason why this teacher has been so important is that in a teacher-student relationship, there's not just information exchange, but there's also an energetic exchange. Because I have been very open with my father and he's been very open with me as a teacher-student relationship, in some ways, I allowed him to walk through the gardens of my subconscious psychic structures And he allowed me to do the same. So in some ways, the teaching did not just reach my intellect, but it reached also my subconscious, and it remained there as hidden seeds. Now, as at the time of the teaching, I did not know that this kind of seeds were left and the value of those seeds. But as I've evolved in my work, in my experience, in my life, I see that these seeds have started manifesting into little plants with some flowers or fruits. And it is still teaching me certain things, even though my father has died for 5 years now. So that energetic exchange is also very, very precious between teacher and student, and it can only happen when there is a close and strong relationship between the teacher and student. It's not an intellectual relationship that is happening. And the third thing that I feel very, very strongly about the teacher-student relationship is that, which I start to realize now more and more, is that when my father was teaching me, I always could sense the presence of my grandfather behind him, and also other teachers in the ancestry. And this made me feel very secure and feel very safe that I am in a home that is inhabited by many wise people who have done so much to yoga. And this is what I now start to feel is happening with me and my students. And sometimes my students say that to me, that they feel that my father is behind me, or my grandfather and father are behind me. They feel that it's not, how do you say, it's not rationally explainable, but it's palpable because it's intangible. People can feel it. And when you really have that kind of connection with a master teacher, you will understand this much more better because you feel that. It's not possible to explain by words to somebody who has not experienced that, or who is not open to experience that. So this is also something that touched me very deeply, because the words of my father were not always his words. It was also the words of the teachers lined behind him. And that gave a great security. Sometimes when he would chant, I would feel that it's not his voice, it's the voice of one of my ancestors. And sometimes I feel the same when I'm chanting. It's not my voice, it's the voice of some other ancestor who is supporting me, an ancestral teacher. And my students feel that, and they say that, oh, Kausthub, today your voice sounded very different. So these are some very powerful reasons why we need the experience of a teacher, apart from the very casual reasons that, we can't really see our own problems as well as somebody outside can see. And that's why mentoring is so important, because we love our negative patterns. We get familiar with it and we don't see it. So that's a very practical reason why, but there's more than practical reasons. And this is what I wanted to share today. But the concept is that a master is not perfect, and a master is always evolving. I have had, I've been studying with my father since the time I was 13 years of age. And I stopped the studies only in my 40s or early 40s with him. Um, and when I look at it, who my father was when I was 13 is very different than who my father was when he was later in his life, 20 years later, 30 years later. So we have to allow that concept that masters are also evolving. You can't be a master in an instant. On the other hand, you are very right, because there are many people in this world, not just in Spain, but all over the world, including in India, who just claim to be a master, even though they are not really anywhere close to being a master. And that's why my father was always of the opinion that, you know, when you are searching for your teacher, keep two eyes open. And when you find a teacher, close one eye. I think this is very, very essential. And the way yoga and Ayurveda and other traditional systems, like including traditional Chinese medicine, traditional Korean medicine, etc., when they look at the concept of health or therapy, they are not only looking at treatment or cure, they are actually propagating first what is called prevention. So when we start to teach yoga techniques, yoga practices to children from a very young age, not just asana practices, but also introducing to them the philosophical aspects of yoga, which I am doing together with one of my students in Estonia, where we are teaching yoga sutra philosophy to young kids of 7, 8 years old. So when we do that, they start becoming individuals with a little bit of better knowledge, or let's say different knowledge than what they are conventionally taught, like mathematics or biology or chemistry or whatever. Apart from that, they have a slightly different view, which will help them to make certain choices. For example, some of these kids who we are teaching of their own, they have said that they don't want to eat meat products so much because they want to resonate with the concept of ahimsa, for example. On their own, some of them have told us that they don't want to drink Coca-Cola or things like that because they feel that that is not necessarily healthy. And these are choices that these young individuals are making, and that is what adults underestimate. Adults underestimate the wisdom that children can have. So when we can give them a platform of education, of uh, a higher thinking, I want to call it, not necessarily higher education, but of a elevated thinking, which can elevate their consciousness and awareness, there is a lot of prevention that can happen. So many physical as well as mental and emotional capacities are grown, and they don't suffer as much. I mean, last month I've had this conversation with these kids, and they were asking me to talk about grief because one of the girls, her family member passed away. So she wanted to talk about grief. And so by talking about grief to these kids, few weeks later, they actually start to integrate some of these concepts into their life, and they feel better rather than feel depressed because somebody has passed away at a very young age, and that could be very traumatic for the young kids. So yoga therapy is having a part of preventative aspect as well. And of course, yoga therapy also has maintenance and, how do you say, palliative care or curative care, which also can be offered. But that's the beauty of yoga, is that it can play a role in all three stages of illness. Prevention, but if you can't prevent it happens, okay, palliative care. And even if that is not possible, at least managing life with a better quality with the illness, all are possible. And I think that is where humanity is realizing this more and more about yoga and yoga therapy, that it's not limited, but it has a much larger scope of practice. We have our dialogues, and I think there are areas where there is somehow some kind of challenges, And these are areas, like I explained to you earlier already, challenges surrounding the intangible principles. See, a lot of the modern yoga practitioners, yoga schools around the world want to understand yoga through Western medicine, like the bones and the joints and the muscles and the tissues and things like that. But that's really a stupid way to understand, because when yoga was presented many, many years ago, yoga, the modern medicine did not even exist anywhere in the world. So obviously the tools of yoga are not based on the way modern science understands the body. So this is what I argue or dialogue with the students from around the world, and slowly help them to realize that yoga is based on subtle principles like prana, like the nadis, the energy channels, etc., the digestive fire, the metabolic fire called Agni, etc., and ask them to become more educated about this so that they can teach yoga in a more appropriate and consistent manner. See, it's like every discipline or philosophy is like a language. Now, I cannot interpret Spanish through German. I cannot interpret German through Spanish. It's two different groups of languages. They don't share the same the same origins or roots. Perhaps there is more closeness between Italian and Spanish, but not Spanish and German, or Spanish and Latvian. It's completely different. So if you have to really understand a system, the same thing you have to do, you have to go back to its origins and understand it from its traditional perspective. Otherwise, it will only give a partial idea, and sometimes even an incorrect idea. And this is one area where we have a conversation between the Oriental approach of yoga and the Western or modern approach of yoga. Another aspect where the concept of dialogue between yoga and Western culture is about the philosophical differences. Modern science, for example, when you take modern science, it is mostly materialistic, where you have to have experimental validation, scientific proof, where you can prove something with a measurement using a machine. But in yoga, it's not just that. There is also intangible dimensions that is not measurable through instruments like prana, for example. It's impossible to measure prana with a machine, at least until now. So this is also another dimension where yoga is looking at, traditional yoga is looking at yoga in a more spiritual way, whereas modern yoga is looking yoga in a more materialistic way. And that's a very big difference, because they are looking, materialism is one direction, spirituality is another direction, and they need to understand that yoga cannot be understood from a material point of view, because it is a spiritual tradition. You cannot deny the spiritual role of yoga. And this is two areas where there is a great debates and arguments that we have. And I think I'm very optimistic, because yoga is very young in the Western world. It's only since 1893 that yoga came to the West, perhaps. And it's only since 1960s and 70s that yoga actually became popular. And it became very popular only in the 80s and 90s. So it's about 50, 60 years of tradition, which is very new, very young. So in another 30, 40 years, I'm quite optimistic that Western world will start opening the eyes to much more different dimensions of yoga. And as yoga teachers like myself, I take this as a time of safeguarding that tradition till that time when people can understand it in a much more deeper capacity. So in a way, I feel like a temporary guardian of a tradition. It's a very good way because when we used to teach, when we were taught yoga by our teachers when we were children, often there would be stories that were told about the asanas or about the names of the sages who are after whom the asanas are named and things like that. And of course, it was all orally transmitted. But the visual medium is quite strong for young children because young children learn by observation and visually they are much more observant. So I think these kind of inspirational cards, which can teach yoga to them, is an excellent way because they can not only look at a picture, but they can also read about a story or be told a story about that, and that could make this kind of interest in yoga more like a joyful experience rather than a very serious experience. Because if you think about it, when you are teaching children, we have to remember that we are not competing with other yoga schools to get the attention of the children. We are competing with video games, we are competing with smartphones, we are competing with the television, etc. So we need to create very intelligent ways to engage the interest of a child. And I think these are very good ways. What we do with the Estonian kids, I told you, is we tell them the stories and we ask them to draw the drawings. And this is essentially what you are doing with this concept, where you're giving some pictures around which a story is told, around which the practice of yoga is introduced. And it's a very remarkable idea. And I think you should continue this and expand it to even more dimensions. Of course, that is where the creativity of the teacher comes in. And when you look at all the Vedic learning that we have, when you look at the Upanishads or some of the classical texts of yoga and other philosophies, they were all taught to young children. And so, if you have to teach very high philosophy to a young child, it's not through very high philosophy, it is through some kind of playful stories. So, the story would be told to somebody as a story to a child. The child will grow up with that story. And like I said, these stories go deep into our subconscious, and later we learn that, oh, this is about life. For example, we have many stories about in the Vedic tradition about the demons fighting with the angels. We call it asuras and devas, and there is constantly fighting and things like that. Now, there are stories told about this in so many different ways, but when you grow up as an adult, you realize that these stories still have meaning because the demons and the angels are our good side and our bad side. It's not one person is good and one person is bad, but within one person there is that conflict. Sometimes we want to do good, sometimes we want to do bad. This is part of our human nature. So the stories are told in a playful manner to young children so they remember, but they contain philosophical seeds that will be realized when a person becomes older. And that is the greatness of introducing deep philosophical teachings through playful methods, because they will be deeply embedded in the psyche of a child and they will grow with it, nurture it, and then they will realize the meaning of that.